done that we say together, and so it is. Well, thank you everyone for being with us today. I'm sorry for the trouble we were having on the bridge, and if anybody's having any trouble with the stream, such is the state of the art of the technology that we're using these days. We want to come together this morning. The title is from the macrocosm to the microcosm, but it could just as easily have been flipped around from the microcosm to the macrocosm, because it's all the same. You see, it's all the same. We have a beautiful image given to us from the East, the parable of the four men who could not see what they were feeling, but they each had a different part of the elephant. You know, and one had his hands on the side of the elephant, and he says the elephant's like a wall, and another had his arms around the leg of the elephant. He says, oh, the elephant is like a tree trunk, and one had the tail and said, no, the elephant is like a rope, and another had the trunk and said, no, the elephant's like a big snake. And they were all right from their limited perspective. And what they did not realize is that they were all looking at different parts of the whole. There was something even bigger. See, something even bigger than the wall or the trunk or the snake or the rope. There was this thing that we call the elephant. So just kind of keep that in mind, that what you and I are doing, the value of that parable is that what you and I are doing is we are grasping onto that which we can grasp, which is just a tiny, tiny part of the whole. And we are trying to understand it. We are trying to identify it. And sometimes we lose sight that it is just that part of the bigger whole. It's that part that we can see of the bigger part that we cannot see. So we're looking at the microcosm, and we don't quite understand the macrocosm, yet they are the same. So Dr. Holmes tells us that if you take a drop of seawater and you analyze that seawater, it is the same essence as the sea. It is the sea appearing in the form of a drop. Excuse me. So think about the water. Let's just think about the water for a minute. And I guess kind of the awe of looking at things much, much bigger than we've ever looked at before or ever considered before, you know. You know, it's one thing to go out at night and look up and see the stars and say, oh, the stars are there. But do we ever really stop to contemplate the vastness of the universe that we see, that we are looking at starlight that left the stars billions of years ago in some cases, that we are looking at what appears to be a tiny dot of light, which is a star, looks to us to be a star, and it's a galaxy far away. We don't necessarily stop and ponder with awe the magnificence of this universe. And that's what I'm encouraging today. Feel the awe. Step into the vastness. So we human beings, we give the ocean different names depending upon the shore that we're standing on. If we're on the east coast of the United States, we say, oh, that's the Atlantic. If we're on the west coast, we say, oh, that's the Pacific, you know. If we're standing on Gibraltar, we look out and say, oh, this is the Mediterranean, see. If we're in England, we might look out and say, well, that's the North Sea. Or in Ireland, we might say the Irish Sea. It's the same ocean. It's the same water. It is all connected. It is us who is making the distinctions and the divisions and calling it by different names. when it in and of itself is one. Now, I can't remember how many years ago I read it, but there was a container ship that was coming from the Orient to the west coast of the United States, and it was caught in a storm, and some of the containers washed overboard. And one of those containers was loaded with these little rubber ducks, the kind of little rubber ducks that we buy for our children when we're giving them a bath when they're babies. We put toys in the bathtub with them to keep them entertained while we're washing them. Well, all of these little rubber ducks, I imagine you even squeezed it and it made a little sound. All of these little rubber ducks were in this container that washed off the deck of this ship and went into the ocean somewhere in the middle of the Pacific. And they knew where it was, they knew where the ship was when it went off. And what the scientists decided to do was to see where these ducks turned up, because by plotting where and when the ducks arrive, they might learn something about ocean currents. So they set up a project, for people to report when they found these rubber ducks wash up on a shore. And the rubber ducks made their way all the way from the middle of the Pacific across the Arctic and came down into the Atlantic, down past Greenland and down into the Atlantic. Now we don't think of that. We think of the Arctic as just vast, frozen, big solid ice. But there's water underneath it. And somehow those little ducks got through, It's all connected. It's all connected. It's all one. We lived on the coast of Carolina for many years, and the Gulf Stream was about 30 miles offshore with some great fishing. But the scientists call it the Great Atlantic Conveyor Belt because it moves warm water from the Gulf all the way up off the coast of Ireland and England. And then it drops down below the surface and it travels back as an stream in the middle of the ocean all the way back down to the warmer water. It just keeps circulating and it just keeps moving the heat from one part of the planet to another. So we look at the water and we can say, well, physically as water, it's all connected because the currents keep moving it and stirring it and mixing it around. Now it may take on different characteristics depending on where it is. Like when we lived in New York, the ocean looked pretty green. But it's because of the temperature and the type of algae that's there. But if you go to the Caribbean, it's a totally different color. It's crystal clear. You go to the Mediterranean, it's even different still. But it's still water. The essence is still the same. And it's not just the liquid form of water, because the sunlight evaporates the seawater. It turns from the liquid water into vapor, into steam. And that steam rises into the air. We sometimes see it as clouds. Everybody this morning was talking about little puffy white clouds. We had a ton of rain come through here the last week or so. And now that rainwater is going back up into the puffy clouds. But the seawater goes up into the clouds, into the sky. And then the air currents move it. And they bring that water back over land where it comes down as rain. I remember a few years ago, there was just a tremendous amount of rain, coming in off of the Pacific and coming in and drenching the Pacific Northwest. And at one time, the weather people, when they were given a report, they said that this jet stream current that was moving the water was carrying more water than the Amazon River. How they figured that out, I don't know. But you and I, we look at a river and we think, wow, we can see that water, but there's just as much or more above our heads that's invisible to us, but it is still water. It still has the same characteristics as water. And then it comes down in the form of rain and it forms lakes. Some of the lakes appear to be landlocked, have no physical connection to the ocean, but yet it is the water of the ocean appearing in the lake. Some of the rainwater comes down and makes its way to streams that make their way to rivers that make their way back to the ocean. Some of the rain comes down and it's frozen. It comes down as snow and it gets locked up into the form of snow and ice, sometimes for millions of years. And then it makes its way back into the ocean. Now, if we step back with awe, we can say, wow, I go to the beach and I look at the waves, and I go to the lake and I look at the water, and I go down to the river and I see the people tubing past me, as they float down the river. And it's all the same water. What is true of the ocean is true of the lake. It is true of the river. But not just that, you see, because what is our body made of? And our body is mostly water. The salinity of our body mirrors the salinity of the ocean. There's a famous quote they play on the TV every once in a while. It was John F. Kennedy, and he said that we came from the sea, we evolved from the sea, and our bodies are still composed of seawater. And when we go back, he was talking about sailing on a sailboat. When we go back to the ocean, it's as if we are returning home. Now, the whole point of all this is just to help us get into that awe, into that feeling, into that realization that we are connected. We are all connected through the very essence of water. We are one. The water that's here today was here millions of years ago. The water that people drank millions of years ago is still here. It is still here. And we don't typically think about that. We go over to the tap, you turn it on, you put the glass underneath, or you put the pan underneath, you fill it up with water, and you don't think about that. And what I'm talking about, the reason I'm talking about this is our spiritual growth. Our spiritual growth is really a growth of self-knowingness, self-realization with a capital S, self-realization. Remembering our way back. Remember I said this a few weeks ago, remembering our way back to our unity with not just each other, not just the planet, but with that which has created us from itself. The divine, right? Many of us grew up in traditional catechism or Bible classes, and we remember being taught, well, God has made us in His image and His likeness, Dr. Holmes might say, we are made in the divine nature, right? Because this spirit, this thing that we call God, by whatever name we choose to call it, obviously it does not have the same human form that we have. So when we're told in its image and likeness, it doesn't mean that God's an old man with a long white beard sitting on a throne in the sky. Its essence, its nature, just as water has a certain nature but takes on different characteristics depending upon where it is. But its essence is always the same. So this essence of what the divine is, this essence, that is the image and likeness that I think we're talking about here. And again, we take water for granted in that we don't think much about it. But how much time do we spend contemplating our own nature, contemplating the nature of the divine, contemplating that we are an expression of it, that its essence is our essence, because that is our growth. That is our self-knowingness. That is our self-realization. Dr. Holmes tells us the only place that we're going to find the divine is within us. That's the only place we have to look. We can't look out there and find it. It is here. It is here. So we have to come to recognize that what we are seeing at the level of the microcosm is that instance where the macrocosm has become us. Has become us. Who by taking thought could raise their height 1 inch or grow the hair on their head, right? This is what Scripture tells us. There is something else that is animating us, that is moving through us, that is propelling us back towards itself. And this is what we choose to discover. This is what we wish to discover. Our quest, if we want to call it the quest. Remember I told you that the legends of the Knights of the Round Table, they were always on a quest. And the quest they were on was to find the Holy Grail. And somehow through the years, that Holy Grail has come to be identified with the chalice that Jesus used at the Last Supper. But the Holy Grail is the presence of the divine within. That's the quest that you and I are on. That's the quest that each and every soul is on. The conscious realization of the experience of the presence and the activity of the divine in us, as us, through us, around us. We can do something the drop of water can't do. We can do something that the wave on the ocean can't do. We can conceive of ourselves as being apart from and different than and separated from the very essence of what we are. And as long as we believe that, as long as we truly believe that, we will behave that way. And as long as we behave in accordance with those beliefs, we will have that experience. But we must remember, it is only an experience. It is only an experience of separation. Because in reality, in truth, we cannot be separated from that which we are. The raindrop cannot be separated from water. It is water, expressing itself as the raindrop. So I invite you to come into this experience of awe, into this experience of wonder, into this experience of having the realization that the essence of what you and I are is so much more magnificent than we have ever imagined. It is more magnificent than our intellect can grasp. We can't grasp the fact that that little dot of starlight that we're looking at is actually a galaxy billions and billions of light years away. But it's there, you see. It is there. Nevertheless, it is there. What is the magic that beats our hearts? What is the magic that takes oxygen from the air and gives carbon dioxide back through the processes in our lungs? See, in science we can study these things and we can see how they work, but not why they work. And this, I think, is an appropriate dividing line to separate the realms of science and religion, or science and philosophy. Science understands how, but not necessarily the why. And religion or philosophy focuses on the why without regard to the how. Now here's a quick example of that. So we have this phenomenon all around us that we call gravity. Gravity exists. We have come to accept wholeheartedly that gravity exists. We know that. We understand that. We call it a law of gravity. There's a law of gravity. Well, it's not a law written in a court or a document. But it's a principle. It is consistent. It always operates. It's always there, you know. And we understand something about how it operates. You know, Newton gave us a formula for understanding the what he called attraction between two bodies based on the square root of the distance between them. He also gave us a formula to understand the rate at which items dropped into space accelerate as they move down. He could describe mathematically how these things worked, and he did it so well that we human beings can travel from the Earth to the moon. We have to overcome Earth's gravity in order to get out of the atmosphere. We travel a certain distance and use the gravity of the moon to pull the ship towards the moon. And we can take a vehicle and land it on the surface of the moon because we understood enough about how gravity worked that we knew how it was going to work when we got there. See? In a similar fashion, you might have read last year, he sent a probe all the way to an asteroid somewhere out there in the solar system. They landed this thing on the asteroid. They picked up dust and rocks from the surface of the asteroid, and now it is coming all the way back to Earth. That could not be done if we did not know how gravity works. And yet we don't know why gravity works. Einstein says that gravity is not a force, that it is a function of the curvature of space-time, which I have absolutely no way of understanding what he's saying. That is so far above my head that I don't get it. But he said it's not a force. Newton said it was a force. Einstein said it's not a force. So here we have two of the greatest thinkers in human history who disagree with what it is. And yet it works. And yet it works. Now, we would not get all superstitious about talking about gravity and say, well, this must be some new kind of religion. Gravity must be some new kind of religion because you can't explain why it works. So therefore your belief in gravity is a belief. It's faith. That's all it is. You have faith in gravity. There's no law of gravity. And he would say, no, wait a second. No, wait a second. If I take something and I hold it out and I release it, it'll go to the floor. I can show you. I can demonstrate that there's something that acts upon this pen or appears to act upon this pen that drops it to the floor. We grasp that little part that we can see. We learn how to cooperate with it and work with it, even if we don't understand why it works. I remember many years ago, I went out and visited the, I think they called it Montezuma's Castle, and there was a couple of other places, but it was around Phoenix, Arizona. These were ancient sites where Pueblo Indians lived. They lived, and what impressed me was how intelligent these people were. I think the dwelling we were looking at was abandoned somewhere around between 1200 and 1400 AD, and they didn't understand why the people left. But they built their homes into the south-facing side of a cliff so that they would be solar heated. The sun would shine in and it would heat them. Of course, they were protected from attacks from above and below because their enemies could not get to them. They were in the cliff. But they had a system of ropes and pulleys where they lifted things up like little elevators. Very, very intelligent people. And they took the tools that they had and they dug ditches from the stream that flowed by there. They dug ditches, and they dug ditches all through the fields where they would grow their crops. And as the water came down the stream, some of the water got diverted. It went through the ditches, it irrigated the fields, and then it eventually flowed back into the stream. Now, I venture to say if you went and asked any of those people why water flowed downhill, they would not tell you it was gravity. They probably had never heard that word. And they might ask, well, what difference does it make? What difference does it make? Nevertheless, it flows downhill. And we have learned how to cooperate with it. We have learned how to dig our ditches. We have learned how to use it to produce a better result in our lives. So what Dr. Holmes is telling us, and for those who have the textbooks, what I suggest that you do is, I have to turn my screensaver back on here. I had network trouble. Read the chapter in the textbook. It's titled Man's Relationship to the Spiritual Universe. It starts on page 106. And this is where he's talking about all these things. So we recognize then that whatever we are is a mirror image in some degree of the whole. We are the microcosm of the macrocosm, that we are made in its nature, its image, and its likeness, and what is true of it is true of us. But only as much of that as we can grasp, just like the fellows grabbing the elephant. We can only grab a little piece of it and work with that. But when we work with that, we want to understand that we are working with the whole, but only as much of the whole as we can understand. And what Dr. Holmes tells us is, now let's come back to this idea of what is it that we know about God. And he says the divine is one, it's whole, it's unity. It's not divided, it's not broken up. There's not this part of God over here and that part of God over there and those sorts of things. But to help us understand, just like people have named the one part of the ocean, the Atlantic, and another part of the ocean, the Pacific, helps them understand where they are, we have taken the indivisible, the whole, and we have divided it into typically three parts, the Trinity. So we say there's one part of the divine that we call spirit, and it is the awareness, it is the consciousness, it is the thinker. It has will, it has volition, it has choice. It decides what it shall have. So we go back to the book of Genesis, and the voice of God said, "Let there be." Put Charlton Heston's voice in there, let there be. It made a choice, it made a decision. And there's part of us, you and I, see, that we are consciously aware, or we can be consciously aware. We can not be consciously aware if we choose to ignore. But we have the same ability of knowing. We have the same ability of thought. We have the same ability of will and of volition and of choice, you see. But then there's another aspect of the divine that Dr. Holmes calls soul, S-O-U-L, or mind, or the law. Now, I must warn you that Dr. Holmes uses the term mind in different ways in different times. Sometimes he uses mind to describe everything. Sometimes he uses mind to talk specifically of the law, or the soul, or the creative medium. And what he tells us by that is there is a subjective part. There is an objective part of the divine that has will, that has volition, that chooses, and that decides. And that is like the seed. That is like the seed that goes into the creative medium, the soil, the soul, the law. Now, the law itself, the creative medium, we call it the law of mind. He calls it the law of mind. It is creative. It is intelligent. It knows exactly what to do and how to do it and when to do it in order to produce the outpicturing, the the equivalent of whatever that seed is. Right? So again, he gives us the example of if you go out to your garden and you have tomato seeds and you put tomato seeds in the ground, you're going to get tomato plants. You're not going to get cucumbers or squash or watermelons or pumpkins, corn. You're going to get tomatoes because the soil and the rain and the sunshine and all of that together works to produce the perfect outpicturing of the seed that has been sown into it. So we go back then to this idea of how does the divine create? It speaks its word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. It speaks its word, and that word drops into the subjective medium, the creative medium, the soul, the law of mind. And then that creative medium does whatever needs to be done, when it needs to be done, in the perfect way to produce the physical equivalent of what has been sown into it, the outpicturing. So we have spirit, we have soul, we have body. We have the conscious choice. We have the intelligence that is subjective in that it doesn't change what the objective told it. The objective said, let there be light, and there was light. The objective said, let there be stars and planets, and there were stars and planets, you see. And just as the soil of your garden can't say, no, 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 I'm not going to give you tomatoes even though you gave me tomato seeds, this creative medium of the universe can only do as instructed, only do as it's told. That's why it's called a subjective. Holmes makes a very good point here. He says that we talk about our subconscious mind as if it was not conscious. And it is conscious, but it is subjective, and that's why he calls it the subconscious mind. So we take the macrocosm, we take how the divine creates. The divine speaks its word, something we call law acts upon that word, and then there is. But we are made in that nature. We are made in that image. We are made in that same likeness. We have will, we have volition. We are connected to all of life at the subjective level. We are connected to this power that creates according to belief at the subjective level. And in our lives, we get to experience the physical outpicturing, the circumstances, whether it be physically in the health of our bodies or in the affairs of our lives, in our business and in our bank accounts and all of these other things that are just details, but are the perfect outpicturing of the beliefs that we hold at the subjective level. So Holmes tells us that this part of us that we call the subconscious or the soul, it is the memory bank of everything that we have ever experienced, everything that we have ever thought, everything we have ever believed is stored there. And that is what the law is acting upon. So many times people will come and say, well, how come I got this particular condition in my life? Why did this happen to me? Why did my tire go flat? There was a nail in it. We worry too much. We try to make too much out of it. We try to go in there as if we were doing surgery and find this particular idea that we had that somehow manifested itself in our lives as an unfavorable condition. And Dr. Holmes says you're never going to find it. It's more complicated than that. So it was like this big stew, this big soup of all of the different things that we have ever believed. But there's this thing that we call the law of mind that, like the law of gravity, we don't know why it worked. All we can say is that somehow it is part of the divine. And it works, just like gravity works. And it is producing in our lives the perfect outpicturing of our deepest beliefs. And then naturally, right, as reflective skeptics, we would say, well, how would you know that? How in the world would you possibly be able to demonstrate that? Well, with gravity, I can take something and I can hold it and I can let it go, and we can see that it goes to the floor. We don't know why it goes to the floor. We just know that it goes to the floor. So we start with this theory, if you want to call it that. We start with this idea that there is this presence in the universe that we call the divine, we call it God, we call it love, we call it spirit, we call it nature, we call it many different names, and it makes no difference to it what we call it. Makes a difference to us, just like the people who call one ocean the Atlantic and the other ocean the Pacific. Makes a big difference to us what we call it, because it reflects our belief about it. And it is for us and it is to us what we believe it to be, because it is done unto us according to our belief. Because the second part of the theory is that the very nature of the divine, since it does not have arms and legs and hands and feet and hammers and nails and saws and things like that, is that creation, the way that it creates, is through an act of will and volition. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. God said, let there be, and there was, and there is. Something acts upon the intention, the declaration of spirit. For lack of a better term, we call it the law of mind, or we call it the soul, or we call it the creative medium of the universe. But if there is a creator, then there must be a means by which it creates. Now, again, we look at the microcosm, we look at the little parts of the universe that we can touch and feel and weigh and measure, and we kind of see this. Energy becomes matter. It exists locked up in the form of matter for a while, and then it goes back to being energy. Galaxies come, galaxies go. Planets come, planets go. But physicists will tell us, they call it the law of the conservation of energy, that there's no more energy today than there ever was. There's no less energy today than there ever was. And there never will be any more energy than there is right now. There never will be any less energy than there is right now. Energy changes its form of expression, but it can never be destroyed, and it's never created. Now that's mind-boggling. Right? I go down here, I'd like to go down to the dam, just a couple miles from here, and take pictures and watch the kids fishing and all those sorts of things. So here's this water that's been dammed up. The water wants to flow downhill because there's this power we call gravity, but we don't understand why it works. But nevertheless, the water's coming down the hill, and nevertheless, engineers have built a dam to raise the level of water up behind the dam, and then they direct that flow of water through a piece of machinery, and that piece of machinery spins inside a magnetic field. Now, what created the magnetic field? Where did the magnetic field come from? How come the magnets never wear out? All of these different things that we look at and say, I don't know. Nevertheless, it spins, and it creates electricity. So we have taken gravity, and we have taken water, and we have made electricity. And it produces heat in the process, another form of energy. But then that electricity comes to our house. And we turn one switch and it turns the light on, and we turn another switch and it cooks our food. The energy takes different forms of expression. but it's still energy. It still goes back to being energy. It always was, and it always will be, which is exactly what we say about the divine. Energy becomes matter and takes on form and has a physical existence, and then it goes back into being energy. What is the process by which energy becomes matter in some particular form? And we don't know. You see, we don't know. Physicists are still looking for it. They found the Higgs boson particle a few years ago, and people were calling it the God particle, because this is the particle that has energy become matter. And the next question you would ask is, well, what created the Higgs boson particle? Where did it come from? Why is it there? You see, we're always just one question away from the unanswerable and the unknowable. But nevertheless, we look at the physical universe and we say, yes, somehow the invisible energy becomes visible matter, and it takes a particular form and it takes a particular shape, and it exists in time and space, and then it goes back to being energy. And the mystic would say, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt amongst us. So what we are getting to here is that if that is the way that the divine creates, if there is a creator and that is the way that the divine creates, and we can look at the physical universe and say, well, it kind of mirrors up. Remember the first part of the textbook, Holmes says, we look forward to the day when religion and science shall walk hand in hand, from the visible to the invisible, from the microcosm to the macrocosm. That we are all trying to get back past this idea of the Big Bang, if you want to call it that, to what is the essence, what is the very nature of the divine, what is the very nature of whatever is there, if you don't want to call it the divine, what is the very essence of what was there before the Big Bang? What kicked the can to get the Big Bang going? As Henry Stapp, the physicist, might say, something kicked that can. Something kicked that can. So we look at this and say, well, if that is the way that the divine works, if there is this creator and it makes a choice and then something acts upon that choice and produces results in its life, and if I am created in that image and in that likeness or in that nature, then that should be true of me as well. And then this brings us to the point where we can do something, where we can conduct our own experiments. Right? Dr. Holmes called it religious science. He said we want to explore these things, these ideas, as a scientist would explore. So now you are faced with this proposition that your thoughts are creative, that there is a power in the universe that we don't know why it works. We can't describe exactly the mechanism of how it works any more than we can describe exactly how gravity works. We can describe mathematically what it will do, but not how it does it. We can't find the graviton particle when they're attracting things together. So we're stuck with this proposition then that we live in a spiritual universe, and the nature, the motive force of the spiritual universe is thought. It is decision. And then it is acted upon by something we call law. And that law acts not just upon the fleeting ideas that we have here and there, not upon the fleeting ideas that we hold for 10 or 15 minutes a day while we are in our prayer or our meditation, but the sum total of everything that we believe. And now, if we wish to prove that to ourselves, which Holmes says we're not trying to delude ourselves, we're trying to prove this to ourselves, we must adopt a deliberate technique for changing our beliefs. Change your thinking. Change your life. Must be deliberate. This power that we call gravity, power may not even be the right word for it, but this phenomena that we call gravity, it acts upon us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, whether we are awake, whether we are asleep, whether we are under anesthesia, having a surgical procedure done. It does not matter if we are awake or we are asleep, if we are conscious, if we are unconscious, gravity is always working. This phenomenon we call the law of mind is always working 24/7. Whether we are consciously directing it with what we wish to have happen in our lives, or whether we are just allowing the unconscious or subjective sum total of our memories, subtotal of race consciousness, sum totals of everything we have ever believed and experienced, boil together in this stew and then give it direction. And now the choice becomes clear. If we wish to know that that law is there and is working for us, we must deliberately look for evidence, and we must deliberately experiment where we are by changing our mind. Now, if you wish to look for evidence, I suggest Dr. Dean Radin has written a series of books called The Conscious Universe, and that's a good place to start. They're difficult for me to read because they deal with a lot of statistics and mathematical analysis of statistics, which I never took. But he looks at different phenomena that might indicate or does indicate that we are more than just a bag of skin and bones, that there is something conscious about the universe itself that responds to us according to the way that we believe. So I suggest that you look for some of those books and start to read. And there are other books as well. Prayer Can Change Your Life. There are other books that talk about different ways, different evidence, if you will call it that demonstrate that there's something more to thought than just something that fires off in the gray matter between our ears. But the most direct way that we will ever know is to adopt a deliberate course of changing our thinking, of changing our beliefs, and then watching the circumstances of our life change. This is how we get to know ourselves. This is how we get to grow. Now, the technique that we teach to do that we call spiritual mind treatment. There are other techniques, but it starts with intention. We have to have the intention that this is what we're going to do, and then there must be consistency. You see, we can't get up for 1 minute, excuse me, for one time, for a few minutes in the morning, and repeat to ourselves that life is good and God is good and all there is love and gee, ain't it wonderful? And then for 23 hours and a half for the rest of the day, go through life complaining about how bad everything is, how terrible everything is, how much crime there is, and all of these things. We have to be consistent. We have to be deliberate. We have to remind ourselves 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as long as we are conscious, we have to remind ourselves that we are constantly planting seeds. And the way to change the sum total of what is going on in this conglomeration of our subconscious, in this stew, as they called it, in this soup, in this muck, which is our personal subconscious combined with the consciousness of the race. Holmes called it race consciousness. Carl Jung called it the collective unconscious. There's this kind of muck, if you will, of stuff that has been believed for bazillion years. And the way that we change that, is by deliberately choosing to pour into that positive thoughts, remind ourselves constantly that we are God's love in action. Holmes said if you take a glass of water and you put ink into it, the ink diffuses through the water. You can't just reach in there and grab a little bit of that ink and take it out. You can't do that. But if you put it under the tap and you let a trickle of clear water run into that glass, over time the ink will overflow and the water will become clear. You and I, every minute that we are awake, we are consciously putting into that glass of dirty water that is our subconscious, our subjective, our race consciousness, our collective consciousness. We are putting into it clear water. And as we do that, the conditions in our lives change. But you will never know that unless you deliberately do it, unless you consistently do it. We're halfway through the year. We got together in January, and hopefully we're all going to get together next January. And the question is the same. The question I asked last January is, where do you want to be on your spiritual journey when we get together next year? We're halfway to that. What kind of progress have you made in the last 6 months? Do you know more about yourself than you did 6 months ago? Do you know more about the macrocosm than you did 6 months ago? Do you know more about how magnificent this thing that we call life and God and love is? And where do you want to be in 6 months? The only way to do that is to know yourself. Know yourself. Try this. Don't take my word for it. Try this. Holmes called us spiritual explorers in the spiritual adventurers in the unexplored territory of mind. Your life is your project. Your life is your experiment. Your microcosm is the place where you touch the macrocosm. Play with it. Experiment with it. Enjoy it. And never lose sight of the fact that you are touching the eternal. And so it is. Okay. And